Study 3. The Covenant with Abraham, the glue that holds the Bible together.
Welcome to our third session in our study of understanding the Old Testament. And so far, we've sort of been laying the groundwork. We've been seeing what God's original plan was, and that really the story of the Bible is the story of God restoring and reconciling everything that was lost back in the Garden of Eden. And then we looked at the structure of the Old Testament, and we observed that out of the 39 books of the Old Testament, that 11 of them tell the story, and that the other 28, in some way or another, fit into those 11. In our last study, we covered, amazingly, about 2,000 years of human history in about 20 minutes. And you've got to admit that was quite a task. But in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which are somewhat controversial, but we emphasize the fact that this is a historical section. Adam and Eve and Noah, these are real people. Oftentimes, the first 11 chapters of Genesis are sort of dismissed as being a religious myth or a parabolic teaching to communicate some sort of religious truths. But there's a huge problem with that because Genesis 1 through 11 cannot be separated from the rest of the Bible. And the credibility of people like Jesus, for example, or the apostles, or the psalmist David, or many of the Old Testament prophets who refer back to these people and events as history. And if they can't get that right, then we wonder, did they get anything else right too? And so the great spiritual lessons and issues of the New Testament, which were taught by Jesus and the apostles, all of a sudden fall into disrepute because we really can't trust them. They didn't get this other stuff right. So we would argue that this is history and that these are real people. And what God seemed to be doing in telling the story of these four events, rather briefly, the creation, God was telling us, I did it. The fall of man, God is telling us, the mess you see is not what I did, it's what man did. The flood of Noah, which tells us that the world that we see is really not what the original creation looked like because of the tremendous geologic activities that took place in connection with the flood of Noah. And then the fourth event that God selected was, in fact, the Tower of Babel incident, which was not simply a bunch of people trying to build a high-rise someplace. What they were doing was building a tower with a temple up on top to the sun, moon, and stars. It was a new object of worship. And God stepped in immediately when He saw that, and He dispersed them, and He did so by changing their languages. There is no explanation for the fact that a guy gets up on Tuesday morning to build the tower, and on Wednesday morning he's speaking a brand new language with their own grammar, syntax, and various vocabulary words. It was sudden, it was supernatural. So with telling us that those events, we then today will move into where the real story of the Old Testament begins, and that is God's covenant that He made with Abraham. And so I'd like for you to turn, if you would, to Genesis chapter 12 in your Bible, and we will pick up where we left off. We have emphasized the fact that in the Old Testament that you have these 11 books from Genesis to Nehemiah that tell the story. And we also have suggested to you that just reading the text of Scripture, we arrive at the conclusion that in these 11 books that tell the story, there are four very distinct periods that emerge, and we have named them the period of formation, the period of the theocracy, the period of the monarchy, and then the period of restoration. What we're going to do today is to begin with the period of formation, which is the longest of these periods. It will, in fact, take about 700 years. And when we talk about formation, What's happening now is that the nation of Israel is now being formed. And to have a nation, you need three basic elements. You need people, you need a constitution of some sort for this people, the law, and then you need a land area. And the story of the Bible, with Genesis 12, moving through Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and into Joshua, the story of those books is the story of the nation being formed. It's always surprising to my students when they discover that this period of time covers over 7 centuries. It seems like it takes forever for this nation to get formed, but I suspect there's some reasons for that. So what we want to do today is to take a look at this period of the forming of the nation of Israel. And the key to this is going to be Genesis chapter 12, where the covenant that God makes with Abraham is given for the first time. The nation of Israel will be the vehicle, if you wish, that God is going to drive for full restoration and reconciliation of everything that was lost back in Eden. Now again, I have no idea why God chose the Israelites. I'm sure Brazilians think that they'd make a better group, or Italians, or the French, or whatever may be your lineage. Maybe we would be better than these people, seeing as they behaved. But God, in His own way, chose Abraham and his descendants, knowing full well that they're not going to behave all the time. In fact, they behave badly most of the time. But then that's what the grace of God is all about, because when God views most of us, we behave badly. And so He has to deal with us. But we want to look at Genesis chapter 12. And so if you would, look at the first 3 verses. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you. And the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And that idea is repeated 2 or 3 more times in Genesis alone, that all the nations are going to be blessed because of you. And that's good for us to know, because when we read the Old Testament, we get the distinct idea that God is interested in Israel only. And I don't know whether God owns a car or not, but if He does, I think He has a bumper sticker on the back saying, "I love Gentiles too." Because while the Old Testament focuses on the life and the doings of the nation of Israel, the purpose is the restoration of all who will believe, all from every tribe, every tongue, and every nation. And again, when we fast forward to the book of Revelation, what do we find? We find that literally millions and millions and millions, untold numbers of people out of every tribe, nation, and tongue have come to faith in Jesus Messiah and have been restored and will experience everything that God has for them. So while it focuses on Israel, let's never forget that the whole purpose is to bring about the restoration of what was lost in Eden. Now, the covenant God made with Abram, or Abraham as he is most known as, the covenant with Abraham is an everlasting covenant. Now, the Hebrew word that's used for everlasting is the word olam. And olam can carry with it the idea of eternal. God is said to be an eternal being, having no beginning and no end. But most likely it has the other meaning of unto the end of the ages. We use the word everlasting. In other words, it has a starting point and it goes on to the end of the age. And so when the scriptures begin to take up the idea of how long does this covenant exist, in several places, such as Jeremiah 31, Psalm 89, it speaks of the covenant being in existence as long as the universe is in existence. Is there a sun, a moon? Are there stars out there? Then the covenant is still in force. So you look out your window in the morning or at night, you see the sun or see the stars or moon, that's a reminder. The covenant is still in existence. The other thing about the covenant, a second thing, is that it is unconditional. And this is very unusual because an unconditional covenant is not the usual kind of covenant. The usual kind of covenant that they used in the scriptures and is really, we have these kinds of covenants today. The idea is of a conditional covenant. You do this for me, I'll do this for you. We had to buy a new car to replace a car that kind of fell apart on us. And the car dealer was a nice guy, but he didn't give me the car. Can't understand why, but we did enter into a conditional covenant. That is, I get that car from you, and I will give you this pile of cash that I have here. And that's, whether we buy a house or whatever, we have a lot of conditional covenants. We don't call them that, but that's what they are. This covenant is an unconditional covenant, and it's different. I tell my students over the years in the college classroom, we have a thing called a syllabus. And what it is a conditional covenant. You do this work, and I'll give you this grade. And you do good work, I'll give you a good grade. Your work is not so good, then you get the grade. But that's the agreement we enter into. Now, I've often said if my wife Ann were taking the course, it would be an unconditional covenant. Because she might say to me, I hate taking exams. I say, babe, don't worry about it. If you don't want to take the exam, you don't need to. You're going to get an A in the course. She says, that's an awful lot of reading, Well, don't worry about it. If you don't read it all, you'll get an A in the course. There's this long paper to write. Well, she doesn't like to write papers. Don't worry about it. You get an A. See, what is that? That's a promise, isn't it? And that's exactly what the New Testament refers to the unconditional Abrahamic covenant as. In fact, when Paul is discussing this in the book of Galatians, 9 times, when talking about the Abrahamic covenant, he talks about it being a promise. Why? Because it did not depend upon the obedience of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or the Israelites. It didn't depend upon what they did or didn't do. Eventually, God would fulfill that covenant promise. So, this covenant is an unconditional covenant, and it depends on God alone for its fulfillment. That's very unusual, but that's the kind of covenant that it was. Now, there's a third element to this covenant, and that is God ratified the covenant. And the idea of ratification is that it makes something legally binding. Now, if you still have your Bibles open, and if you just go a few chapters past 12 into chapter 15, we discover there that Abraham is really concerned that he's 99 years old. His wife, who's 10 years younger, a spry thing, at 89, but they have no children. What's going to happen? Look, there's not a gynecologist in all of Canaan who's touching this case. A 99-year-old man and an 89-year-old woman, and you don't have a baby and you want a baby. I don't think so, folks. But God had said, Abraham, you and your wife Sarah, you too will have a child. Well, this was tough. And so at age 99, Abraham comes to God and basically says, look, Lord, it's not happening. So what are we supposed to do now? And what God does at that point is say to him, I told you what's going to happen. And so that you know, you and I have entered into a covenant, and I give you my word, which was good enough, but I will give you my word, and we will make this covenant at this moment in time legally binding. And so God said to Abram, Abram, I want you to get a goat and a bunch of other animals and cut them in half and lay the pieces on either side. God didn't need to explain to Abraham what this was about because Abraham probably had done this many, many times. So, Holly, come on up here for a minute, and we're going to cut a covenant, because when the Bible oftentimes says to make a covenant, thank you, it has the idea of cutting a covenant. Now, Abraham probably would have done something like this quite often. Now, I happen to be a landowner in southern Canaan, and I have an abundant supply of water. I've got a really good well. My shepherdess friend, Holly, she has a large herd of sheep, and she wants to bargain with me about having access to my well of water, but she's going to have to pay, right? She's got to come up with some sheep. No gold bars necessary, but sheep. So let's do that, okay? You want a well of water?
Absolutely. I offer you 10 sheep.
10 sheep. Be realistic. 20.
15.
Okay. 15 it is. Well, after we make, and chances are the arguing and bargaining went on longer than that. But what we would then do is that we would take an animal. This is representing a goat now. And we're going to take this goat and we're going to cut it in half. One half of it goes here, and one half of it goes here. And what we have, when we decide upon this, Holly and I will then walk between the pieces of sacrifice, and the moment we do that, this covenant is now legally binding. It is like when the notary at the bank puts the stamp down, signs it, that they were witness to your signature. That transaction is now legally binding. So that's what this cutting of a covenant was all about. It was one way that they did that. So Holly, thank you very much. I'll be expecting my sheep by the weekend, if you would, please. Okay. So when God said to do this, Abraham knew exactly what it was all about. Now what happened next, of course, was totally unusual, because I don't know what Abraham was thinking, that he and God were going to go between the pieces of sacrifice together, but it never happened that way. God put Abraham into a deep sleep, and in vision form, or in some form, Abraham saw God going between the pieces of sacrifice by himself, which not only ratified the covenant, but emphasized the fact it's going to take one person only to fulfill this covenant. It's an unconditional covenant. And that's what the rest of the Old Testament verifies. This is, in fact, an unconditional covenant. So, it is now legally binding. Now, what were the basic provisions of the covenant? There are three basic areas. Number one was to the man Abraham himself. And God promised many things to Abraham. Abraham, for example, would be a very wealthy individual. And you know what? God made him very wealthy. Did you know that Abraham probably had 1,000 servants? He is rich in gold and silver and animal and livestock beyond anyone around him. God indeed blessed him materially. He also said that he would be the father of many nations, and he never saw that, but he did see his grandsons. We can figure that one out. The text doesn't declare that, but when we look at the chronology, he would have seen the birth of his grandchildren. And so the things that God told Abraham, some of them came about in his time, and others would be in the future. Kings would come from him, and so on. The second aspect of the covenant was to the descendants of Abraham. And the book of Genesis is very careful on telling us that it would be through Isaac and Jacob. Because Abraham actually, when the dust settles on all of this, he's going to have 8 sons. One only by Sarah. But Isaac would be the covenant son, and then that would go on to Jacob. They would be given this land. they would eventually occupy the land forever. The third aspect is where you and I, who are not Jewish, maybe some of you are, but I am not. I have no blood of Abraham in my vein that I know about, but I have not been excluded. God has always been interested in people like me who aren't from the descendants of Abraham. So blessing would come to the entire world, and this would be through the descendants of Abraham, and finally to the seed of Abraham, who is identified beyond a doubt in the New Testament as Jesus from the tribe of Judah, from the line of David. And so this is going to be the vehicle that God is going to use now to restore what was lost in Eden, and in fact to enhance it. So this now is a key place. I don't want to overstate it, but I am convinced that Genesis 12 is really the cornerstone chapter of the Old Testament, because that's the initial giving of the Abrahamic covenant. Now, as the Old Testament proceeds along, you have chapter 13, 15, 17, 22, on, where the covenant is expanded upon, greater details are given. The bare bones of it is given in chapter 12 and includes these three elements. So, if we could visualize this for a moment, I've created a chart to try to tell us about the covenants that God has made with Israel. And you can see in the lettering on the bottom there, we have the four periods: formation, theocracy, monarchy, and restoration, then coming up to the New Testament. Initially, God dealt with mankind apparently individually. In other words, there was no special nation, there was no special family or clan. It was like one-on-one. God with Noah, God with Enoch, God with Cain and Abel and all of that. But when Abraham comes along, we have an entirely different story. And so now we have the covenant being made. As the Old Testament progresses along, we discover that the Abrahamic covenant has what I call three sub-covenants that flow out of it. They develop thoughts that were given in seed form in the original giving of the Abrahamic covenant. For example, God said to Abram, I am going to give you a land area. And in very general terms, he said from the river of Egypt, which by the way is not the Nile River. It is the Wadi El Arish. It is the dividing line from ancient times between Canaan and Egypt. God says, I'm giving you that to the river Euphrates, but that's pretty general. But as the land covenant is developed, we have other things given related to the land, that Israel gets the title deed to the land at that moment in time, which, by the way, is quite significant, isn't it, in today's political arena as to is there going to be two states in that land over there or what? Well, the title deed was given about 2000 BC to the nation of Israel. But God was clear. You don't obey me? You're out of here. You'll hold the title deed, but you won't get to live here. And then eventually he said, the day is coming when Israel will return to the land and will live there forever, never to be removed again. So these kinds of things are developed in Deuteronomy and even in the prophets like Ezekiel, more information about the land area. God also told Abram, look, you're going to have seed or descendants, and kings are going to come from you. Well, what we discover is that that's exactly what happened. Many nations come from Abram. But the key, of course, is that which comes through Isaac and Jacob, and the key will be the man David, which puts us way into 2 Samuel to be sure. But David is going to be the king who will, from his line, will come the anointed one, Messiah. We call him Christ, which, as you know, is the name Jesus Christ. That's not his first name and second name. It is Jesus, the Anointed One. That's what it is talking about. So you have the king aspect, the seed aspect. But the third aspect has to do with in you, Abraham, all the nations are going to be blessed, which gets back to the problem we have, which we talked about in a previous study, the problem of sin. That is, because of our bad attitudes and behaviors and so on, there's a separation that occurs. And how do we get across that separation and get back into a relationship with our Creator? That's what religions attempt to do. But God has the better plan, and because it's complete and perfect. And that plan is going to be developed in what we call the New Covenant. The New Covenant has to do with how we solve the sin problem, and that will be solved by God Himself. And it isn't just the covering up of sin, it is the removal of sin entirely, which makes it possible for flawed people like you and I to be able to actually have a relationship with our Creator, who is now also our Savior. Well, as you can see on this chart, all of these covenants come to the time of the New Testament, and while this is beyond our study here, the reality is that the promises could have been fulfilled when Jesus came the first time. John the Baptist came on the scene, and he basically said this: would you like the Abrahamic covenant to be fulfilled? If so, you've got to repent of your sinfulness, and secondly, you must receive Jesus as Messiah. For 2 years, Jesus went around demonstrating that he was indeed the Messiah. Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that before Jesus came along, there were 70, count them, 70 individuals who claimed to be Messiah in the 100 years or so before Jesus came. Well, here's this guy from Nazareth saying, I'm Messiah. Take a number, buddy. You're number 71. But he went around doing miracles and so on, which put him in a world apart and made these incredible claims about himself. Well, the nation of Israel listened to this for 2 years, and finally they said, nah. He's an agent of the devil. That's who he really is. And you talk about, this is the second greatest decision that was bad, following Adam and Eve. Because what happened then was the offer for the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant was withdrawn at that point. Well, God made a promise, didn't He? It's an unconditional covenant, so He has to fulfill it. Because as the scriptures say, God doesn't lie. So what's going to happen in the future is that it will be fulfilled in the future, but this is what the Messianic Age is all about, is that this is going to be a time when Jesus Messiah will come. And did you know that there are 8 times more prophecies about His second coming than there are about the first coming? And the first coming was being born in Bethlehem, and all of the things that are stated were fulfilled exactly, defying all mathematical odds that could be the case. But there's 8 times as many references to His return. And Jesus said, I am returning. Don't think I'm not. Delay is not denial. I am going to come back, and we're going to fulfill the promises God made with Abraham, which then includes all of us who are Gentiles, who will be a part of the blessing. Now, we need to, we've mentioned these sub-covenants, and we can move through them rather quickly here. The land covenant simply develops the concept of the land area that Abraham was given in seed form. You have the Davidic covenant where the issue is developed of the seed, but particularly of the king. And then you have the new covenant, which has to do with how in the world God is going to redeem mankind. In fact, in the upper room the night before the crucifixion, remember Jesus met with His men and He raised the cup and He said, this is the new covenant in my blood. Everybody knew what He was talking about. He was referring back to Jeremiah chapter 31. So, with that in mind, let's push on now with the story, keeping in mind that these 3 sub-covenants flow out of the Abrahamic, which is everlasting, unconditional, and legally binding. And all of these covenants are unconditional, everlasting, and legally binding. God is going to do what he said he's going to do. Now, when we look at the life of Abraham, and we have to walk rather quickly through this. Hopefully, the storylines are somewhat familiar to you. God chose Abram, for whatever reasons we don't know, in Ur of the Chaldees, which is located in modern-day Iraq. And while he was there, he was a worshiper of the moon goddess, and how in the world he came to know the true God, those details are not given to us. But God said, as we read, leave your father and mother and head to the land that I'm going to show you. So he does. He heads north, but he ends up in a city of Haran, and for reasons not told to us, he spends 20 years there. He's about 50 when God talks to him down in Ur. And so by the time he gets to the land where he will settle down in the southern Canaan, in the area of Beersheba, he will spend, that's where most of his life is going to be spent, down there. But he's about 75 years old when he gets into the land. So it's been 25 years since God said, I'm going to make a great nation of you. Well, this, you got to admit, you're probably squirming a little bit now. 25 years have gone by and we have no kids. Okay, on into the land we go. And so he's made this covenant, he's ratified the covenant with Abraham. And the rest of the story from this point on, remember, is trying to fulfill the first element of a nation, which is peopling the nation. And so we have this story that goes on. When Abraham is about 85 years old, I mean, God's had 35 years to get a kid in here, and there's been no child. Well, Sarah came up with this brilliant idea, which Abraham signed on to it. Where they came from in Ur of the Chaldees, there was a custom that if a wife could not produce a son for the purpose of inheritance, this is particularly wealthier people, if the wife had a personal handmaid, which would be property, she would own this handmaid, the handmaid could produce maybe a child, a son. And if so, then the child from the handmaid would be credited to the wife's account, and therefore a genuine heir. Well, that's exactly what they did, and lo and behold, at age 85, Abraham has a son by the name of Ishmael, and he is as happy as he can be. I finally have an heir, Ishmael. In fact, he's going to cry out when God says, Ishmael's not the one. He's going to cry out and say, oh, Lord, could Ishmael be the covenant son, please? And God says, no. I told you, you and Sarah were going to have a son. Well, 13 years or so pass, and you find that on this occasion of the ratification of the covenant in Genesis 15, God says to him, 1 year from now, you and Sarah are going to have a baby boy. Well, this brings all kinds of chuckles from Sarah and from Abraham. But after they recovered from their session of hilarity, they sobered up and realized we are talking about the God who creates life. And sure enough, 1 year later, little Isaac was indeed born, and now the great nation has 3 people in it. We are making progress after 50 years. We've gone from 2 to 3. But again, the story is of a very slow process, and I want to remind you what we said in our last session, and that is that God apparently is doing this to make sure that people understand, that Abraham and his descendants understand that I am in charge of peopling this nation. It isn't just normal sexual, biological processes that's going to do it. I am in charge of peopling the nation. So we then go on to Isaac. Isaac is 40 years old when he gets married, but he marries a girl by the name of Rebekah, and he's 40. At age 60, they don't have any children. You say, oh my goodness, this is going to take forever to make a great nation. But again, God's establishing his purpose. So they eventually, 20 years later, come to the Lord and say, Lord, babies maybe? And God says, okay. And twins are born, Jacob and Esau. Esau is the firstborn of the two, but Jacob, amazingly, is declared to be the covenant son. So Jacob is now going to be the covenant son, and this, of course, is going to cause huge problems because, unfortunately, Isaac and Rebekah are not going to get Parents of the Year award because Isaac loved his boy Esau, and Rebekah loved her boy Jacob. Well, that doesn't work too well, you know. My daughter sent me a shirt this last Father's Day that said, "My favorite kid sent me this shirt," and she wanted to make sure that I took a picture and sent it to her brothers. Well, I did, but the brothers' reaction was quite interesting, of course. But you don't do that, do you? So anyway, we come to Genesis 22, where an amazing thing happens, and that is that God tells Abraham, "I want you to sacrifice your son, Isaac." Isaac is probably a young teenager at this time, and you think, what is this about anyway? I mean, why in the world? God doesn't ask for human sacrifices of all things, but of course the text says it was a test of Abraham's faith, but it was actually a lot more than that. So God said to Abraham, "I want you to take your son and as a burnt offering," which means you'd slice his throat, you'd bleed him to death, and then you'd take the body and you'd burn it up. Well, how does that work for a beloved son? We who are parents can't imagine ever doing something like that, and we're scratching our heads. What in the world is going on here? But Abraham went with this son Isaac to a mountain of Moriah. And the New Testament tells us that the reason why Abraham was a man of faith is that he believed God. Well, what did God say? He said, "Isaac is the covenant son." Well, if you kill Isaac, what's going to have to happen? God's going to raise him from the dead. Well, there have been no such things as resurrection, but he believed that God, the giver of life, would do that. See, that's what faith is. Faith is not wishful thinking. It's not hoping for something. It's believing what God has declared. So, let's take a look at this. This is fast forwarding a little bit, but it is very important as to why God did this. This is a drawing of the Mount Zion, the Jebusite city of Jerusalem, which David eventually took and made his capital. Because the city was so jammed, there was no place to build a temple. When a temple was to be built, Solomon, his son, would build it on the mountain up there, on this, which is called Mount Moriah. This is the very place where God told Abraham to take his son and sacrifice him. Now, what's significant about this is that when Abraham gets ready to kill his son, and you have God stopping, saying, "Okay, I got it. You do trust me. By the way, there's a ram over there in the thicket. Use that for a sacrifice." He said, "I will provide a sacrifice for you." And you know where this is? This is where the crucifixion took place. About 100 yards from where the Temple Mount is today is the site of the crucifixion. Jehovah Jireh, God will provide. You think that's an accident? No, it wasn't. Abraham was ready to sacrifice his son, and God was going to sacrifice his son, but he would not withhold the knife because that was the way in which he would be able to redeem mankind. So, moving through this now, we will just point out that Isaac lived longer than any of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, the fathers. But we know less about him. And the reason is that the story of Isaac is really told in the story of Abraham, his father, and in Jacob, his son. We really don't know a whole lot about Isaac. But he does marry Rebekah, as we pointed out, no children, and finally, you have the covenant son born. As a part of the story, which initially might not seem significant, is the fact that Jacob and his brother Esau didn't get along, and you have two factors there. You have a birthright, which belonged to the firstborn in a family. They got a double portion and so on. And then the blessing. And here's the storyline. Jacob was second born, so the birthright was not his. And so the birthright gave you a double portion, but it also heaped a lot of responsibilities on an individual. They were the priest of the family, they had to be the protector of the family, and all of that. And he, of course, was kind of like number one in the family. Well, we don't understand the mentality of Esau, but my guess is he wasn't too hot on point number two, all the responsibility. And so that fateful day, when he bargained with his brother Jacob, remember he came in from spending days of hunting and came up empty, and he's starving to death. And Jacob has just cooked up a really mean pot of stew there, fresh bread and butter, maybe some strawberry jam there as well. And Esau comes in and says, man, I want that. Jacob says, I'll tell you what, you can have the pot and the whole loaf, trade it for your birthright. And we think, talk about stupid. How do you spell stupid? How about E-S-A-U? What's wrong with this guy? But he did. And that was done, by the way, in ancient times. You could actually bargain and trade for your birthright. But why would he do that? Well, because he understood he was Dad's favorite. And when the last will and testament, which is really the blessing, would come, he was going to get it. And he knew that. Jacob deceives his father and Esau and obtains the blessing for himself. The way they did it was they had basically what was called a formula that was given. And when that formula, a very specific formula was given, it was like the last reading of the will kind of thing. It was legally binding. And so he gave it the last form, and then he gave the blessing to Jacob, and Esau didn't get the blessing. And so, needless to say, Esau is not happy with Jacob at all. In fact, I think he went down to Obed-Edom's bar and grill, and he bellies up to the bar. He says to his buddies, dear old Dad is dying pretty soon. He's old, but we're going to have 2 funerals. Jacob's going to be planted right after we plant Dad. Well, Rebekah hears this, the mother who loves the son, and says, get out of town, son, get out of town, because troubles are brewing. So Esau, by the way, on a spiritual note, is used as the classic example in the New Testament as the guy who lived for the moment, lived for the present, I want it now, and mortgaged their future for present comfort, pleasure, and so on. So you might read that in Hebrews chapter 12. He has to get out of town, and get out of town quickly because his brother wants him dead. And so he flees up to Haran, and the first person he runs into is a relative, an absolutely gorgeous girl by the name of Rachel. The text of Scripture says she was beautiful in form and face. I mean, she had it all. And so you have him meeting Rachel, falling in love, and makes an agreement with Laban, the father of Rachel. And he agrees, I'll work 7 years for you. And so he did. And wedding day comes, they're heavily veiled, and the great switcheroo of the book of Genesis takes place, because who does he marry? Her older sister Leah, who is as homely as an unpainted barn. I mean, all the looks went to Rachel, you know? So he says, what have you done to me? And he says, my bad. Didn't I tell you? In our custom here, the younger child cannot be married before the older. Didn't I tell you that? Oh, so sorry. You got Leah. And Jacob says, you know what? I want Rachel. Yeah, I'll marry Leah, and I'll do another 7 years, but 7 days from now, I want wedding number 2. And so a week later, I don't know if this is a Guinness Book of World Record or not, but he gets married twice in 8 days. And he marries Rachel. So what this does, of course, is then tell us where God now begins to populate the nation. And what we find is that during this period of time, he's going to end up with 4 wives, and 11 sons. He has daughters also, but as far as the scheme of things, it's the sons that are important. He will then return back to the land again. Leah, who is the unloved one, all of a sudden does something that no one in the family has done for the past century, and that is she produces sons like crazy. One right after another. Well, Leah's stock goes up. She stops having children. Rachel is very upset by the fact that she's getting beat out by her rather homely older sister. And she hasn't had any children, so she does what Grandma Sarah did, and that's to slip Jacob her handmaid. And sure enough, 2 sons are born to them. And then Leah sees her do that. She does the same thing, and eventually Leah starts having babies again. We have 10 sons born, and then finally, Rachel has a son. His name is Joseph, and he becomes the firstborn of the favorite child, and this will have a ripple effect throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Well, God is peopling the nation, and now we need to see how He's going to develop the line from here on and then move on into the law aspect of a nation.